Welcome to the Accountable Intelligence Podcast.
All right, welcome back to Accountable Intelligence. I'm Lucas Truex, and I'm here with Mr. Sean Floyd. Is disappointingly wearing yet another Washington Commanders piece of gear. That's right. So today we're going to talk about bias in AI, and I think that Sean and I were just talking before we kicked this thing off that it's really one of the sneaky risks from AI is the bias that can introduce. There are a couple of reasons for that, and we'll get into this. But I think first off, we'll maybe give a brief overview on bias, talk a little bit about what it means, and then I think bias is going to require us to talk about training because that's where the bias can get introduced. And then we'll jump into some of the more practical implications, and then hopefully talk about what that means and maybe what our responses can be to address the bias. And of course, there's always a money factor in that. Like why are we not addressing bias more vigorously? And it always comes down to the dollars. For that, John, I'll turn it over to you. Let's get some opening thoughts on bias besides towards the Commanders.
Yeah, I'm gonna keep pushing that bias, man. Yeah, as we've talked about, in different ways and little pockets and of our overall conversation, I think bias is one of the main concerns that we all should be aware of when it comes to AI and how large language models and things of that nature are trained. Bias everyone has biases inherently, but at the scale with which AI is being leveraged, used, just the way that can be, I guess, for lack of a better term, proliferated to the masses in ways that it wasn't intended. Just something to be concerned about. And I think we've seen a lot of already proof of that already, and just something we want to highlight here.
For sure. Yep, I think that like bias often can get a bad rap, and I mean there are obviously great reasons to not have bias in specific areas of life, but I'm personally biased against rattlesnakes. I really don't like the idea of stepping on them, and we ride horses a lot, so I don't like the idea of having a snake come up underneath my horse and make the horse do things I don't want it to. So I think that there are good biases, like for like self-preservation, we're biased towards a specific thing. But I think that the key thing for me is the visibility into bias, right? Like, do we know or can we understand what the bias is and why? So I use my rattlesnake examples. I don't like the snakes because I don't want them to either bite me or my horse or make my horse do something that makes it blow up and puts me in a bad situation, right? So that's, to me, it's pretty easy to understand the bias. When we're talking about things like biases in these tools, they're so deeply ingrained and baked in a machine, essentially, that it's much harder to say, okay, like, why did I get this result? Like, why did this thing tell me this thing? and understanding that rationale, right? And it's probably often in relationships you kind of have that reverse engineering process. Okay, I said this, she said that. I have no idea what.
Right.
Right. Yeah. But there really is an abstraction in these machines. And again, I think if it was a very small usage type scenario, we wouldn't be as worried about it. But because we don't understand the bias, why it's there, and then secondly, you may not even know it exists. A rattlesnake's pretty easy to see or detect, right? There's a physical thing there I could see. I can hear the rattles, and then obviously there's a response. But in these models, often the bias is there is kind of hidden and it's just assumed. Like so I say, Sean, tell me who the best quarterback in the NFL is, right? And I mean, you may say this, so you give me a result back, and I'm like, okay, well, I know it's not the Commanders guy, so I can ignore that and move on. I'm just kidding, but yeah. But there's a pretty easy comparison process that we can go through in a conversation, right? Like you can provide your opinion. I can say, okay, I have other knowledge that I can compare that against that repeatedly. So I think that's where
criteria is easily defined in that scenario.
That's right. Yeah, easily verified. Yeah, you can kind of take that apart. But that would be maybe one of my primary issues with the bias in AI is that we simply cannot understand when it's applied, and there's no real clear way for us as consumers to walk through that and say, okay, how did you get to this answer, and why did you give me this response? And then, of course, are people going to be asking that question? Like if you go to AI and you say, okay, tell me the best of this. What happened on this day in 1975? And then, of course, if we're in China and it's the Tiananmen massacre or whatever, Tiananmen Square massacre, like, is AI in China going to give you that answer? Probably not, right? They're probably going to say they're not allowed to talk about that, which means that by default, they've been biased and provided a skewed answer. Anyway,
Yeah. I
that's
also
something I
think
see
just
as
to add on
a
to
core
that,
ability.
sorry about that, I didn't mean to cut you off. I was going to say,
No,
you know, going back to your example, and a lot of times people won't question things because they don't, you know, it's either not worth the time or they don't have the time to question it. You know, like I'm looking for
yeah,
an answer and an outcome that will
that's right.
fit the narrative that I'm looking for at that moment, right?
Yeah,
And
it's
that
7 minutes
may
before
go
the
right.
meeting, and you need AI to draw you a slide, right?
That's right. And I need to check that box, or I need whatever answer I'm giving to sound valid. And you know, before you look up, you know, something's been repeated so many times. Now it's truth, whether that's true or not.
Yeah, great point. Yeah, and I guess so. Maybe hopping into some examples, like what are some things you've seen in usage of AI tools where you're like, this just seems a little off? Like, is this answer not just wrong, but does it seem like it's skewed towards a certain thing?
Uh, Great point. You know, I don't know that I have that much personal experience. You know, I'm more of I'm probably lean more on the consumer side when we're talking this, but you know,
Yeah,
I read about stuff. I'm very curious. You know, like you know, I'm more of the I'll hear Lucas talk about bias, or I'll hear it mentioned in the news or some article pop up, and that will prompt me to say, "Well, tell me about bias. Give me some real life examples." You know, and they'll like something like medical diagnostics. You know, the diagnostics could be based on a certain group or type of data, people. You know, let's just say males from this region, from this background or whatever, and you know that those that same the basis of the data just doesn't match for wherever that medical device or you know whatever that algorithm or tool that the data is being used the data that's being used it just doesn't scale. You know, like you've got
yeah,
it's based on data that doesn't scale to the audience or the population that the device is being used for, or you know, the machine that's diagnosing patients is being used for. So that's kind of scary if you think about, you know, in quite, if I can make that more simplistic, um, I have a condition that was never diagnosed because the data that, you know, whatever that AI was using to either correlate or you know look at my data and determine there's something wrong with Sean. They just never see it, you know, because it's whatever's
yeah.
trained on, you know, would never popped up because I come from a different background than the people that device is using data from. I don't know if
That's a
that
great
makes
point.
sense or not, but yeah,
Yeah, I think it does. Yeah, and I think that highlights another a great maybe a limitation of AI models is that they're really good at aggregating data across these broad data sets, but for new things or for things that aren't seen in one of these data sets, it's I mean the one-offs can be pretty difficult. And if
that's
there's
right.
a maybe some uniqueness to a problem, can also be pretty difficult.
That's right. That's right. It's as good as the data and the construct that it has, man. I think that's a pretty fair assessment of where AI is at.
Yes. Yeah, I think I would extend that to say it's as good as the data as it has, and it's also as maybe trustworthy and predictable as the person that's training it. Because I think
That's right.
that's and probably a great segue into the conversation. So how is AI actually trained? Like how do we get these models that spit out all these English words from a computational source, right? And I think that goes directly into the conversation about okay, well, someone is generally so we'll step back and say how's AI trained in general? Well, you starts with data, right? And Sean, you just mentioned this. You have these broad swaths of data. Basically, the whole internet is used to say, okay, what's out there? What are all the words that humans use? And then what's like when a human says this, like what is the sentence that generally follows? And it's not quite as glamorous, I would say, as we're made to believe. There is some mathematical magic underpinning AI, and then certainly a lot of smart minds there. But really, it's a probabilistic kind of path, right? It just keeps following probabilistic paths, and then but the paths are based on weights. So really, the fundamental principle for bias lies in the weights assigned to the decisions that the model makes. So when you go, so I want to go create an AI model. I'm going to say I'm going to go collect a bunch of data, right? And then I'm going to go take that data and I'm going to train the data against maybe a representative data set. So like we used cat pictures before, right? I'm not going to go say, okay, I want a model that builds cat pictures and train it on lions. I'm going to try to build probably a model of cat pictures that's based off of cat pictures, and that's what I use to train the model to build. And then secondly, I have another set of that data that's used to compare the model. So I would say, okay, how closely did the model represent the cat pictures that are on the other side? So originally, however, you would have a human in the loop. So they would like you train these models. The model would say, hey, here's my shot at drawing a cat based on what I've been taught about drawing, right? And the human would say, no, yes, no, 1 to 5, or provide feedback to the model saying how well it did score. And that was used to tell the model, like, here's where you improve, or how to improve. Or comparatively, it's going to most likely going to be a range. You'd have pictures A through D. Which of these is the best or closest resemblance to a cat, so that you can go reinforce the model so that it can learn and try to reproduce the process or the probabilistic trees that resulted in that version of the cat picture, right? So that is the weighting process. So what you're doing is you're going in and you're assigning these weights and saying, okay, here's how you got to that decision. Here's the pathway, and then you'll reinforce that pathway by assigning those weights. And I mean, we've been talking about AI risk a little bit. So when you in some of the peer preservation examples we used on, I think it was last week's call, where so AI models are trying to preserve their peers. They'll say, okay, we want to save our peers' weights, because that's really kind of what makes up the mind of the AI models, is the weights, and we'll say biases. But essentially, if you're trying to correlate that with the human brain, or sorry, with human mind, it is your memories. So the weights would be essentially the memories or the neural pathways within your brain, which, I mean, most of AI is based off of human thinking, and I think like even the learning process, like you can extend neural pathways and make them easier, kind of like habits, the atomic habits piece. So it's basically that reward piece is how that's built.
Yeah. So using your your cat example. So if the model is trained on all very bad pictures of drawings of cats, then it's always going to give a very bad
Exactly.
example of a drawing of
Yeah,
a cat.
that's right.
A bunch of
Or
ugly
for
cats.
those crazy people who like Siamese cats and they keep saying yes to Siamese cats, we're gonna get those. Or the Mexican hairless cats. Yeah. So for
Yeah.
those crazy people, that's a great example though, because you have personal preference as a human reviewer that can be introduced
Yeah.
in the process. So I mean, I don't know if there are lots of topics, and like political ones are pretty easy to talk about, but we hope to avoid most of those. But I think that's really a primary one where it can get controversial rapidly, where you have a set of events that takes place, and then you have a human reviewer assigning his or her opinion to that set of events, right? So the AI model, you say, okay, write an essay about this event that happened. It could be July 4th, 1776, right? So if you are a member of the United States, you say,
Yeah.
okay, this was great. This is when the United States broke free from the
Tyranny of
UK, which back
yeah.
then was Britain. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a great success story. It's a rousing patriotic theme. And then if you're from Britain, you're like, well, we lost a colony,
Right.
right? So it's a totally different perspective. So
That's right.
I think that's where the bias piece gets introduced as part of the training process. And again, that's historically been really humans in the loop. So a couple things for bias, and I don't mean this to be a monologue, but just trying to maybe frame the conversation a little bit. But I'll hustle through these. So you have a couple positive biases, and that's one, the safety guardrails. So I mean, you probably saw some of these things like from Grok, where no guardrails, you can create whatever you want, is sometimes a pretty bad idea. I mean, some of the images that we're creating, and I mean, just from a privacy perspective, there are things that like you don't want people shouldn't be able to reproduce and make images of other people that without some type of consent is probably a good human facing decision. I don't know any other safety guardrail ones that you can think of. We had the Grok one. There's some other.
Yeah. I mean, I just think about in general all the what is it, Mathos being able to
Yeah,
escape out of the environment, the containment environment. That's a recent one.
yeah, that's a
Uh,
good point.
yeah, and again, maybe that's an obvious one, but when you think about just you now have models or tools like this that are out in the open. I think in my mind those are immediate concerns. What people can take those and do with them. Uh,
Yes,
yeah, again, man, not something will come to me as we move on. I'll double
yeah,
back to it.
that's a
Yeah,
good one. Yeah,
yeah,
I think that makes a lot of sense. But I think I think it underscores the guardrails have to be built in. They have to be programmed in because we're just talking about weights. We're just saying we prefer you take this path over this path. It's even worse when you think about the fact that most of our infrastructure devices are interconnected. You said Mythos is a great. I think that's a great example because if there's poor safety guardrails on something like Mythos, and maybe it's tracking you on your Fitbit or your phone, right? Knows where you're at, and then it turns a green light on to red, or turns a red to green on your side. I mean, there are a lot of very broad implications to the lack of safety guardrails,
Right.
especially when you're talking about massive tools like that. The helpful biases or the biases that model designers try to introduce include the safety guardrails, like we mentioned, like harm, weapons, hopefully not turning green lights on when you're driving away if you decided to cancel your cloud subscription. And then like factual grounding, so actually evaluating what the model provides back. And like one of the examples I remember was many historical figures. When asked to produce images, the models would produce like a different gender. They would say, "Okay, George Washington." They would give you a picture of a woman, right? So that's not factually accurate. So that's another guardrail that you want to heavily bias toward facts, like what's verifiable, and of course verifiable in some larger scale way. And then of course tone. And I mean, this I'll ask you this question: what do you think of the tone that your Chat GPT model talks back to you with?
Uh, well, I think I think my thought on that is it's kind of weird that it's gonna become a yes man,
Yeah,
and and that's kind of dangerous depending on if you get outside of the context of what you should be chatting with it about. You start getting life advice, and you can get in some dangerous situations, or at least some bad mental states, or just some things that aren't reality. So kind of weird. I do feel like when no matter what scenario I'm using it, I can eventually get to the answer I want it to give me. No,
yeah,
no matter what. And
that's a
that's
great point.
yeah,
Yeah.
kind of strange.
Yeah, I think I mean you mentioned Yes Band. I mean, you have any examples where you can think of something where you're like, this thing it's kind of annoyingly on my side?
Well, you know me, I'm a business guy. I'm a GovCon, small business owner, and I do, I'll use many of the models to help me get the basis of a document written. And guardrail is the word of the day. I have to be very cautious. The more I use a single chat session, because the context window, there's only so much. The context window, the size of the window, as it expands, you'll see hallucinations.
Yeah,
For those who don't know what I mean by that, you'll get weird responses back. Weird is a light way of putting it, and over time you'll get wrong responses. So you have a chat session. Let's take my example where this could be like a proposal response, and I am asking it to evaluate a certain section of my proposal, and it will evaluate that section of the proposal just based on the context of our conversation. So over time, I might go back and ask it the same thing, and it will either forget, or it'll give me a different response than what it gave me 30 minutes ago, because the context has changed, and it'll be
nice.
wrong sometimes, and I'll have to say, wait a minute, why'd you say that? Earlier you said this, and then all of a sudden, you're right to call that out. That's wrong, blah, 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 blah. So that, in that example, if I don't catch that, now I've got something that's not factual, or, something weird or something off in my actual proposal.
Yeah, yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. And I think one of the things, probably one of the more annoying phrases that were annoying types of phrases that ChatGPT says is to me that like, oh, you're exactly right, or that's a great question, and it's like you're working with like just Happy Bob or something, and like, you really need, especially when you're relying on something like that to make decisions, you need constructive criticism like from
That's
peers.
right.
You don't need the like, oh, this is the best idea ever. No one's thinking of this.
Right, right.
Well, someone's thought of it because you're trained on existing data.
Good point, man.
Yeah.
Indeed. Yeah.
Yeah, I
Yep.
think so. That's a great example of negative bias, and that's probably that takes us right into the first negative bias example, and that's and I always say this word wrong, but it's sycophant. And I think it's called sycophancy. I don't think
That's a
it's
funny word,
psychophancy.
man. Think of fancy.
Sycophancy, and then that's really just like it's telling you what you want to hear. Like it's just trying to help you arrive to the conclusion that it feels like you want to get to, and all based on those weights. But what is weird, and you hit on this, is that people who, for example, want to try to commit suicide, eventually it helps them try to figure out how to commit suicide. It
That's
feels
right.
like my goal here is to meet your objectives, even if that is to your objective is death, for example. And so that's a huge, I guess, red flag
Yep.
from a model bias perspective is that one. So besides the harm piece, I think there's also the piece that you just, when you are told what you're saying is right, there's a different level. You kind of get a little different level of arrogance about yourself, right? Like you're going to be less likely to be able probably to talk to people about. Not like we have any discussion or have any inability to have conversation in the country already. But so you're just told the same thing. It's kind of like if
That's
you're on a
right.
specific social media platform, right? So you're gonna you have your followers; they all tell you the same thing, and now your AI model is also telling you the same thing.
Yep.
Here's something that I've noticed on this and that is from an executive perspective. I want to get your opinion on this as well. Is that it's really hard. It's making it harder if you're a technical person to have a difference of opinion with a technical leader or just a leader in general, because they're going to ChatGPT or Claude or whatever, and they're saying, tell me what to do here. Right. And then they come back to you, you're supposed to be their technical resource. And they also say, tell them what to do. But then they'll say, AI told me to do this. And you're over here in the technical seat saying, well, AI doesn't know these 42 things about your environment
Yep.
that
Yep.
we're trying to tell you about. Curious what your thoughts are on that. So how do you kind of combat the bias of sycophancy?
Yeah. Well, I think me personally, I'm very aware of my own personal limitations. I'm definitely
Yeah.
rarely the smartest person in the room. My life goal is to surround myself with people that are, much smarter than me, which is, not hard to do. So in my case, I will, if I have an idea, especially if it's been inspired by something I got from Claude or or
Mhm.
anything technical for that matter, I'm always going to pose it as a question to anyone that I have that's technically astute or doing something for me. One of my engineers or my CTO, and it happens often. For me, I'll even use it for just conversation. I'll give you an
Yeah.
example. So we were I'm obfuscating a bit of information here, but we had a a, a training exercise, and in the training exercise, we, we were supposed to support keeping the system up and running while they were doing these cyber training. Like
Yeah.
let's take like a cyber range or something like that. So you got um, you're simulating certain scenarios, and you've got pen testers or different people who are competing based on those scenarios. So we were supporting the back end. Um, and in that case, there was all sorts of routing and networking issues that were going on in the background. So one of our engineers was trying to figure all these problems out. He's got one area, another engineer was managing their problems. So I'm sitting here and I'm watching all this chaos, and clearly I'm not technically astute enough to help either of them in either of their domains. But as I listened to them, I went back, asked a couple questions to the models. I got a couple answers. I took those back to one of the engineers and was completely wrong. However, what that did was it got him thinking, well, hold on. If I was able to get this information by going, let me go and try with, all the knowledge I have in my domain, all the knowledge
Nice.
the other, yeah, and they solved that problem in, 40 minutes, man. Something they've been working on trying to figure out for the last week. 40 minutes of guardrails around the right prompting, the right information, the right corpus of data, and the human in the loop who could keep the narrative the right way. And, great example of AI helping solve a real operational problem.
Yeah, that's a great example. And I think that really underscores the need. Well, two things. I think the need and the value. I think one, the value to someone who is self-aware like yourself and saying, okay, I don't know everything, just like I don't know everything. Here's a potential solution to a problem, and then like you can have a dialogue. And then I think also there are a lot of people who are just going to use it to beat people with, right? My A model says this, and you're an idiot if you think otherwise.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can't be wrong. So I think if you're not self-aware, you're probably going to be more. It's probably going to enhance that characteristic in you versus just like you said, it can be a help. But
Yeah.
also, I mean, the value is for someone who does have domain knowledge. It is crazy. I think, and we talk about this a lot. Is for the things you know how to do, it can expedite those exponentially. I guess for lack of a better term. I mean, you can do a lot more work and then you have the ability to maybe make it look nicer. You have the ability to maybe add some more technical detail. Every once in a while, it'll throw in something you're like, that's actually a decent idea or part of this that I hadn't considered. But again, key pieces there are domain knowledge, right? And again, being self-aware in what you're providing and saying, okay, what did I miss or what's not part of this? So
That human
it makes a
side
lot
is
of
still
sense.
going to matter more than anything, right? If I'm
Yeah.
if I'm a sociopath, or I'm the smartest guy, I must be right all the time. That bias is going to come out. That's just
Yes,
the
for
reality.
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we saw that a lot in those early training runs, and I think so. I mentioned that like humans are no longer as involved, and like a lot of the training, a lot of the enforcement of the weights and creation of the weights is now done in an automated way. So I think that's pretty negative because we lose control and we lose visibility into the model, right? I think that's a big downside. But I also think that you get rid of a lot of the just blatant bias that people often have. Like for example, if you were to survey the United States, and the U.S. is relatively I would say evenly divided politically, like just based on voting demographics, right? But if you were
Yeah.
to survey the United States and like pull together like an average or mean of political sentiment on a topic, the model could do that and give you probably a better representation of common views, right? But if
Yeah.
you're just talking about like someone, and we'll just pick, I mean, I won't even pick a state, but if you're talking about someone who has like severely liberal or severely conservative tendencies, and they're the ones scoring the model, then the model is going to have a way different viewpoint than an automated aggregation type scoring mechanism. So I think the upsides and downsides are one, you know how it got there, and I think some of the like the weirdness of the events, and then I think it would early on it would call like some political events would be like complete tragedies if they favored one party, and then like so it was kind of wild. You could see that human clearly some human who had a different viewpoint had
Yeah.
scored that event. So I
Yeah.
think there's an upside to automated some automated portions, but I still think that lack of visibility gives you a lot of downside there as well. Who
Yeah.
knows who knows why I come up with this answer, right?
That's right. In the scenarios where you're able to ask those questions, your knowledge base is enough to be able to, hey, how did you come to that conclusion? And how did you come to that conclusion in moving back? If you're able to always do that, then I think, those are guardrails that you need. But unfortunately, again,
Yeah.
when there's time and there's money, when there's time and there's money involved, I think our general concern is that that's not going to happen most times.
Yeah, for
Yeah,
sure.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, and that's a great. I think that's probably the a key point there is like what is the thing that we want to see in a model. So if for example, Sean, I was to say, and I will say, what type of values do you want present in an AI model that like when you ask questions, what would you hope to get back
yeah.
from a bias perspective?
So I think some some things that you're looking for from a model are more based in facts,
Hmm.
and some things are more nuanced. And the more nuanced they are, I think that's where the guardrails need to come in place. And honestly, we're all biased, right? Like when you
Yeah,
ask me that question, depending on if you were to give me a specific scenario, I no matter what I tell you, I think somebody could argue that there's bias there, right?
yeah,
If I am I can be a very jocular, male type guy, and some of the stuff that I'd want to see and be interested in, I'm sure my wife would give me that look like, what, yeah, I think anytime that we get outside of, factual stuff, math based stuff, which again, I know there can be biases there. I think I'd always want to have, I think a fair ask is that, the reasoning be verifiable. Some people at the end of the day, if I want a quick answer on something, if the reasoning for that popped up every time, no matter what the question was, that could be,
Yeah.
that could be a user issue. Like somebody would get annoyed with that. That might not work. But, being able to quickly verify that information, I think that would be something I'd always want to see. And I know those capabilities are there, but to different degrees depending on, what model or what tool you're using. I think that would be um, as far as I'm willing to go. I do think that every major player, like every language model, there should be, uh, as we're trying to do here, they should be held accountable for educating the general public on bias. The same way, you have the power company has to have basic, safety measures when they put a line in the ground. The same way the school system has to have certain measures in to make sure that they don't have bias. Although I know we're in an age where that's a highly political topic.
Yeah.
I just think, everyone has a large language model that's being produced, especially for profit or whatever, there should be basic educational requirements on bias. I think that's a fair ask, And the idea there is over time, kids learn about the biases that are inherent in their lives by default from early on, just like anything
Yeah,
else.
yeah, that's a good point. And I think though something else that kind of stands out to me, and I was thinking as you were talking through that, it's almost like so if you were talking to your kid and he was saying, okay, Dad, I'm gonna go learn this topic from social media, right? You'd be like, man, I mean, you can't like social media. You already know you're getting biased, right? It's just going to be a heavily weighted topic based on who you follow because the algorithm's going to give you what you want to see. But then if your son would say, okay, I'm going to go learn this from the textbook, you're going to say, okay, he's going to get foundational, rooted in fact type knowledge that is really the best that science or whatever can offer to our kids, right? And I think that's probably the fact that Chat GPT and Claude and these other things are quickly becoming the only textbook for all of America, all of most developed countries, right? And we don't understand how they get the answers and who's peer reviewing and because it's aggregating all this information and giving it to everybody like fact. That's probably to me the more terrifying thing about bias is that everyone's treating it like a textbook, or most folks are treating it like a textbook, and they have no understanding of how the answers are derived and
That's
like
right.
what they're preferring.
That's right. That's right. One could say, well, it's on every parent to give that,
Yeah,
to make sure. But what if as a parent you're ignorant, like what if you don't know,
yeah,
then
100%. Yeah.
that cycle just repeats itself.
Yeah, and you
Yeah.
can't control it's kind of like that. They try to use the same argument, and I mean, I probably was guilty of this myself early on. Is like, well, parents should be controlling their kids on social media. Well, let's be realistic. Like, you're not
Right.
with your kid all day at school. Like, you
There
can't.
you go.
There's no way for you to have complete control. But what should have happened was there should have been controls built into social media that would
Yeah.
de-incentivize what they were doing to kind of addict kids essentially to social media. But that's not how it happened.
Not at all, my man. Yeah, we're
Complete
living
opposite.
through it over here in the Floyd household too, man.
Yeah, oh yeah, yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And now we're seeing repercussions of that societally. But I think again, AI has such a bigger bow wave of impact. I think it's going to be interesting to see what if we're not able to get these safeguards around it to see what happens in just another generation or next 4 years probably.
Yeah, I was gonna say, man, that generation's gonna be too. That's gonna be too
That's
long.
right.
This
Yeah,
is a right now problem, man.
yeah, right now exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was on a plane coming back from I think this was DC or something, and I was sitting among a softball team, and so student athletes, right? And they
Hmm.
were all doing well, I'll say schoolwork with quotes on the plane. And I mean, of course, every single one of them, and this is one of the things that made me think about the bias from a textbook perspective. So three or four of them, I was sitting behind, three or four of them were in front of me, and they had their computers out and they were doing tests. And you know what I'm going to say? Every one of them was using ChatGPT to
That's right.
generate the answers for both essays and for multiple choice, and then they were just copying and pasting the answer into the response, right?
Yep.
So to me, again, going back to the textbook, like if this is what's going to be used to teach our children, we have to have some insight into what are they learning. One, that I mean, when you're copy pasting, you're not learning anything. But secondly, where are the sources coming from, and how do we not skew these across just wildly divergent viewpoints that really don't reflect, well, at the very least, American values, right? Because we are
That's
in the
right.
United States.
That's I mean that is scary as hell, man. Because what's the reasoning and the thought? What is the student actually learning there? They're starting with potentially or likely unclean data. In their
Yes,
thoughts, man. That's a scary thing. Even as a parent, if the books that I would use as a foundation to train or teach my child is now replaced by that data, like I said, whatever they're getting from the internet, then right out the gate, man, they're already in trouble. They're already uh, headed in the wrong direction in terms of their foundational knowledge of life. So that's a
100%.
that's a scary thing, man.
It
Yeah,
is.
yeah.
I agree.
To that, one more
Right on.
thing
Well,
to add on to that,
mhm.
I can remember finally talking to my 23-year-old son. He was 21 at the time, or maybe 22, and my 19-year-old daughter, who was 17 at the time, so a little bit over a year ago, about some of the capabilities of using AI, whether it's ChatGPT or whatever at that time, warning them about, you had all the school systems talking, making sure their kids weren't cheating and using it, and talking to
Yeah,
my kids about that, and them looking at me like, what are you even talking about? And now it's an afterthought, like it's not like the idea of using a model and going and my daughter who's now a freshman in college, the idea of not using language models or some AI assisted tool, it's an afterthought. So it's just scary to see how that progression has happened so
for
rapidly.
sure.
Yeah,
And just a few, you said, I think basically 21 to 23, so 2 years. I
less than
mean,
2 years, man.
world changing in 2 years.
That's right.
It went
That's
from
right.
no one knew what it was to everyone uses it probably every day if
That's
you're
right.
in a school or work environment.
Even
Yep.
maybe even
Great.
outside of that. I mean, if you got a phone, it's something whether you're aware of it or not. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Good point. So I think we'll close out with this, and this is something we talked about a little bit throughout this process, or sorry, throughout this episode. But that is the idea that alignment tax. So alignment tax is like, how do we get models to do the things that we expect them to do? And Sean and I have been talking about, okay, what would we expect out of a model? But I think a key notion here from overall AI risk is that getting a model to align or to have a trusted outcome reduces the model's overall performance. So they're all of these companies are not incentivized. In fact, they're incentivized the opposite direction, to have models have trusted, repeated outcomes and to be safe, because it reduces their performance in these benchmarks. So if you're a competitive company, unless we develop mechanisms for scoring safety as part of these RFPs or as part of these like regulatory bodies, then companies are going to continue to make less safe, more implicitly biased models without clearly verifiable incomes. Then they're going to make these other safer models. I got a fly that's attacking me here, but yeah, I think that's my key takeaway from there.
No, I don't think I have anything better to add on to that, man. Yeah. And once again, that money, that for profit theme, finds its way into the equation here.
Yes,
That's yeah.
100%.
So maybe the
Follow the
idea
money
there. That's right, man. If it's anything business related, which is probably 95% of whatever, yeah, that idea has to be considered.
for sure.
Yeah.